Hello Montana, I'm Daniel Larson and I'm running for U.S. Senate. Trying to go around and capture what Montana voters truly care about so I can represent them when I get to the United States Senate. The theme of my campaign is STOP, which stands for See the Other Perspective. I want to do this campaign different. I want it to stay small. I want it to be focused on who I am as a person. If you have anything you're concerned about, reach out. Let's have a conversation. All right, so I'm Daniel Larson. I'm running for U.S. Senate in the state of Montana, challenging U.S. Senator Steve Daines. It's a race I think I'm going to win. And I'm here talking with Lee, a voter from the Flathead Valley. So if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Lee Calhoun. I'm an engineer first and foremost. I've spent 30-some years in the world of real-life engineering. It was for Kodak, which is a company that some of you may have heard of, but nowadays they're not exactly what they once were. And since that time, since I took an early retirement from them, I've been involved in alternative energy things. I like to claim that I put in the first cost-effective solar energy in the Northeast in my yard in Sodus, New York, which is near Lake Ontario, in the snow belt where the sun doesn't always shine. Mm-hmm. So anyway, with that as an introduction, I'm ready to chat.
Yeah, so maybe it's probably worth noting that you and I met each other because you had found out I entered the race and you were thinking about doing the same thing because you had a couple of opinions about where the Republican Party is. You want to describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll talk about that. Let me just elucidate and say that I was actually planning on running because it looked at that time like nobody was going to enter the primary to challenge Steve. And it was my opinion, as it apparently turned out, that it was Dan's opinion that somebody needs to do that people shouldn't run uncontested. So I guess I've lost my train of thought other than the fact that
it's just you were just as passionate, and you were probably just a few hours away from doing it yourself, right?
That's true. Yeah, I was going to pay my fee and get started the next day, but it was very clear to me at the time, and I think it's still true, that a whole small batch of piranhas chasing Steve around is no danger. Hopefully one bigger fish or something like that can take a bigger bite.
Yeah, and so we met, and you wanted to figure out whether I had a chance to do this, and if I don't do this for you, then you will be very disappointed. Is that correct?
That's true. Yes.
Yeah.
You're carrying all my hopes and dreams. So.
Oh man, I'm honored that you at this point are willing to entertain the idea that I have a chance. I believe I do. You were saying that there was some voters in your area that kind of saw the original articles on me, some of the original news coverage, and they weren't thinking that I was quite their brand of Republican. Is this true?
Yeah, I did get that from a couple people that I had been talking with previous to meeting you, because I was chatting with some people who are diehard Republicans here about entering the primary. And part of why I was chatting with them was just to find out whether or not anybody in the state of Montana would vote for somebody like myself. So, I think that I do or would have offered something for the electorate, in the sense that obviously I'm, a couple years older than you are.
Yeah, wiser, more experienced. You've got to, yeah.
Yeah, maybe there's some of that. We always hope for that. So anyway, yeah, the initial response that I got from people just from the news blurb that you were entering was not totally positive. And, you know, you kept saying that you think that people need to get to know you and that you are able to change their minds. Toward that end, there's a young guy that he actually works with me from time to time, who got a chance to listen in on the phone conversation that I had with you after that meeting. And he wasn't very positive about your chances to begin with. And he said this in an unsolicited fashion after you and I were done talking for a few minutes. He said, I like him a lot more now than I did before the phone conversation started. I didn't tell you at the time that I had it on speakerphone, but you know, he heard it and he liked what you had to say. So
yeah, and hopefully I get a chance to talk to more of the voters in the Flathead Valley. Originally, I was planning on just putting a kind of a road tour together with, you know, going in a travel trailer and just starting to get to go back and forth with a lot of the different voters one-on-one. So I guess the COVID-19 has kind of put it into this space. So thank you for doing this. I think that my theory of putting down a large bed of content, because normally politicians don't actually let you get to know them very well, and it's more kind of rehearsed. I think I'm pretty confident that if I have to go toe to toe on any issue ad hoc, that I can kind of have a reasonable response, and I'm enough of a learner or an interested person to understand when voices are wiser than me and learn from people. And I think I can show my decision-making capabilities. So we'll see. I'm gonna win this. So just hang out and wait. So what questions do you think that I can answer for the voters up there in the Flathead Valley that they might be interested to hear offhand?
Well, this may be an edit out. So if we're talking about the Republican Party, then okay, let's go there if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I do mean the Republican Party. So I plan on win this with 76,000 Republican votes in Montana. So.
Okay. What questions can you answer for the people up here in the Flathead? That's a good thing to ask yourself, because obviously it's real important. I think it's a matter of they need to get to know you, as you said, but they need to get to know you that you represent their values.
Right.
Their values being small government. I would hope, and I would hope that Montanans are going to respond to this. There was a time when I was young. This gets back to the part when, you know, I'm an old guy. I grew up during the time of Ike Eisenhower. And I remember when I was a kid growing up that the Republican Party in those days represented its constituency. It also represented integrity. And the opposite seemed to be true, you know, as a generalization for the Democratic Party at that time. There was Mayor Daley in Chicago. There were the Troons in Albany. There was, I think it was Tammany Hall in New York City, if I have all these things straight. But basically, they represented corruption in government or corruption in a political party where that corruption was run from some centralized location, and they didn't always represent their constituency well. So I would suggest that, you know, this is the life experience kind of thing. I would suggest that changed during the time of Richard Nixon. You know, having lived through that, seeing what happened, the whole 9 yards, that changed. And there were a lot of people who worked with and for his represent his what's the word that I want?
Administration. Yeah.
Yeah, who came out of that and seeded forward and pop up their heads at various times all the way to the present. And usually when you see their heads popping up, you frequently see some headline attached that has to do with, shall we say, a lack of integrity. That's
right.
about as kind as I can say it. It's my impression that the people of Montana are very pragmatic.
Yep.
As I myself would like to think that I am, and that they care about integrity.
Yep. And I think that you see it within we talked about the Solutions Caucus within the Republican Party and the Montana legislature.
Yeah, we did.
And those folks, I think, are saying, no, we have a responsibility as legislators to represent the people of the United or of our state,
right?
And then that we have a responsibility to get things done in a reasonable manner. So I think that what Senator Daines doesn't understand is like the 20% of the activist vote in Montana doesn't necessarily apply to him, and then there's a lot of people such as yourself that actually value integrity. The other candidate that entered, he's pretty much just harping on the Reagan, the Lincoln model. So he's putting out blog posts. They're pretty well thought out. I think he's got a heart in it, but I think that I can develop a coalition. I'm reaching out to other legislators to make sure that I understand how to kind of represent the needs of Montana in a way that's independent of the corporate voices that I think are controlling the conversation. And this is the divisive conversation as well. So hopefully that strategy will resonate with the voters up there. So.
Yeah, one of the things that you see if you look at Daines' voting record is that he has voted, depending on which one of the last 2 years you look at it, either 92 or 94% of the time with Mitch McConnell. So, if I look at that as a Montanan, I'm thinking, are the things that I care about here exactly the same things that benefit the state of Kentucky? I'm guessing the answer to that is no.
Well, plus there's a lot of small things that if he really had power, he could really bring home to the voters in the state. So like when we're talking about cattle growers, they're facing some really hard economic times. The beef industry has a huge amount of industry consolidation, and then they stopped purchasing and so they stopped with this whole coronavirus virus, the whole purchasing of beef carcasses at scale. And then there was they're getting record high prices for their box beef, and then they're paying the producers record lows. And so the cattle growers in Montana are competing with Mexico and Brazil, and I think Daines could have helped out there. They're asking for things like origin labeling on beef. I think that's something that if Daines was gaining power by voting with Mitch McConnell, he should have brought home to the state ahead of time. So.
Yeah, I look at that a little bit differently. I don't disagree with what you said about the ranchers and the cattle growers and that kind of thing, but I look at it as why does Kentucky get 3 senators?
Yeah.
And Montana really only gets 1 because Steve Daines has forfeited his vote for the people here. So that's, I also think that people here have a strong sense of it's a matter of we need term limits.
Right.
So if you count his time in Congress, Steve Daines has been there will have been there for 8 years.
Yeah.
From my point of view, it's time to term limit him, fire him, and send him home. Let him get a real job.
Yeah, and I think that term limits are a conversation that it's like by the time you get the political will to actually institute term limits, we might be 15, 20 years down the road. And I think that if we start working with the electorate and saying, okay, U.S. Senate positions are 6 years, and if power corrupts people, then maybe we want to send senators there. They can learn how to do if they're representative first and then they go to the Senate. I think that's a responsible model. The Montana legislature actually got rid of term limits, I think, in the 90s, and they had a couple of issues with lobbyists kind of gaining a larger proportion of control because they were the ones that were sitting in Helena as these other representatives and senators were in a high rotation. So it took a while to kind of get on their feet, but I think they've got some better models. So there's a two-way conversation in Montana after instituting it, but I would say at a federal level, we should expect people more than just term limits. We should expect people to be independent of some of the corporate influences in politics.
Yeah. I agree completely with being independent of the corporate influences.
Yeah.
Can we do some simple math here?
Yeah, absolutely. I love math.
Okay. So Steve voted for what they chose to call, for publicity reasons, the tax cut a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you received any tax cut in your.
I'm paying more taxes this year. I just did them the other day than I was last year.
Yeah. Okay. So the tax, I call it the tax scam. So I'm going to refer to it as the tax scam because it clearly has been, and we'll demonstrate that with some simple numbers here. So that has led to $1 trillion deficit.
Yep.
So if I were to put into my calculator $1 trillion,
it's hard. Does it fit?
Yeah, it fits. I have a scientific calculator. Remember, I'm an engineer. I've got lots of spaces for zeros and all that. So I put $1 trillion into my calculator, and let's say the population in the United States is now something like that's 330 million. Let's do something like that. So if I divide this $1 trillion deficit, which he voted to codify into law for as far as the eye can see, by the population in the United States, I come up with a number that is $3,000 every year for as far as the eye can see for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That basically, Steve Daines is writing a check in every man, woman, and child's name. He's signing it and giving that to a bunch of billionaires. Now,
all right, so let's restart the conversation right around corporate socialism you were talking about.
Corporate socialism, yeah. I was talking about how much money got given to the big corporations and to billionaires.
Yeah.
And I asked you the question, did your taxes go down? I know my taxes didn't go down.
Yeah, and I think tax policy in the United States of America, people need to be aware that the regular taxpayer is footing the bill.
Yeah.
And then it's insufficient to meet the government spending. So we're only taking 3.8 trillion dollars in a year, and we're spending $1 trillion, 4.8. Trump had actually promised that he was going to eliminate the national debt in 8 years. And so, but he was on track to grow it. I think it started right around 20. He was on track to go to 28. But I think after, COVID-19, we might see that happen in 4 years instead of 8. So
yeah.
The only bipartisan stuff happening in Washington is spending money. So I definitely think that being 105% GDP or debt to GDP is a problem.
That's a huge problem. If you look back at Japan in the late 80s, you see what happened to their economy when their debt to GDP got so high that basically their stock market crashed. Oh, I guess maybe ours has too.
I think that they were pricing into the market so when the government bailed them out last time, that $4.2 trillion, I think everybody's on Wall Street said, okay, well, I guess we'll just go ahead and keep making bad decisions, and the government will just step in again. And
Yeah.
I guess they were right. So
Yeah, I am what I call a filthy capitalist.
uh-huh.
So when it comes to capitalism, I really believe in it. It's unfortunate that we don't practice it here in America. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I am really a fan of is not bailing anyone out, essentially. So let's say that the airlines, for example, right now they've got some real issues. Let's say that United and American went bankrupt, just hypothetically.
Yep.
I don't have a problem with that because there will come a time when this COVID thing is over with and there's going to be a need for airlines. The fact that the CEO of United and American, why should we bail them out? Somebody else is going to buy up those planes and run another airline. So the service is still going to be there. The fact that the airlines have spent, 97% of their free cash flow on stock buybacks. That's great. If I was a stockholder, I would think that's great. The stock's gone up and all that. But if I'm a stockholder, I understand that there's a danger there. And the danger is that they won't earn money. They'll go bankrupt. You have to investigate that kind of thing.
Well, I think those two airlines were kind of suffering a little bit before this. And when you're talking about Mitch McConnell, the fact that his wife is the Secretary of Transportation, and they were hit with the the Boeing recall and suffered immensely. And so they're using this stimulus check to prop up those two airlines. Based off of the recall, but it was just a competitive issue. So it's the government getting involved. I think Delta, I heard, was actually doing pretty well as far as cash flows and all those things.
Heard that. Yeah,
because they were in the Airbus fleet more than the Boeing fleet. So a lot of these things are kind of getting all wrapped up into one thing, and I think the American public is being sold that, hey, this is COVID-19, but this is transportation, this is energy, this is it could potentially be housing. It's stock prices. So.
And I'm glad you said energy. Can I talk about that for a second?
Oh yeah, well, you're the expert, right? So what's on your hat there?
Okay, so I'd like to come back and talk about energy some more at another time. But anyway, there are people in the fracking industry, billionaires again, who are highly leveraged. So this is kind of back to what I said again. So your business model's highly leveraged. Something goes south, that happens. They're expecting to be bailed out, and the current Republican Party, so it's tied in back to that, was planning on bailing those guys out and not giving an equal amount of incentive, if you will, to like wind energy and solar energy and geothermal and those kinds of sustainable things. And fortunately, that got taken out of the bill because they refused to give an equal amount. So whether that's coming back to haunt us or not, but it makes no sense. Why would you bail out somebody's business who has a business model that's so highly leveraged that it can't withstand downturns? I mean,
and talking to voices of the set in the state, I get a little upset because I wasn't even aware of some of the issues. So I knew that there was federal spending that had been cut back pretty uniformly in like education and things like that. But I'm talking to librarians that can barely provide a public service. I'm talking to mayors that are having to do bake sales to get an ambulance running. It's like with that amount of money, if that started off at a community level, if we're going to go ahead and start to issue, we have to be looking for a return, and there has to be a civic return on that spending. And to say to all these corporations say that, yeah, we're doing all this GDP and we're creating all these capital flows, but it just doesn't work out in society that way. And it's been sold the wrong way.
I'm going to trot one of my favorite statistics out.
Okay.
The S&P 500, so the 500 largest companies in America.
Oh, you sent me the list, right? The ones, yeah.
I don't know if I sent you that. So since 1980, 1980, what year were you born in?
79.
Okay, so you were 1 year old. Since you were 1 year old, the S&P 500 has not created a net new job in America since 1980. And
wages have been flat. Isn't that weird? Yeah.
So I'm going to now.
And we gave all the power to the Republican Party. We should have had it. We should have had it good by now.
Yeah. So that's one of those things that I like. So are we supporting the wrong horse in this race?
And I was telling you a little bit. So when we first met, I was a little bit more naive than I am now. And
okay.
So I was telling you how interesting it is when you go through FEC filings of candidates, because you're like, okay, well, how do they make any reasonable decisions if you're getting all these contributions from energy, from banking, from it's like there's no way the voice of the people can even be represented because you're just getting all of this money. So
let's talk about that for a second. So I believe you have called Steve Daines' office to voice an opinion in the past. I know I have.
Yeah.
So I can honestly say that Steve Daines, on the couple occasions when I've called his office, did not personally take my call, right?
Yes, this is true.
Yeah, he didn't take my call. But I can guarantee you that if some vice president or president or CEO of Procter & Gamble called, do you think he's going to take their call?
I think that they might have his cell phone number.
Yeah.
Yeah. And meanwhile, he doesn't. I think it's been, a couple hundred days since he's had a town hall in the state.
I don't know.
It might be longer than that. But currently, there's a GoFundMe. This guy is in the Montana hashtag on Twitter. He's got a GoFundMe to encourage Steve Daines to hold a town hall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I think the voices in the state have been like, where have you been, Steve?
Well, one of the things we know about where he's been is, was it 2 4th of Julys ago when he was in Moscow?
Oh, yeah. And what else was going on at that time? Do you remember?
I think there was some kind of an investigation. I've lost track of that kind of thing. Is that what you're referring to?
I don't know. It's like me. Yeah. So I don't want to spit like conspiracy theories because maybe there is a decent reason for him to be in Moscow 2 4th of Julys ago. But
I don't know the answer. It just seems suspicious to me at the time.
Yeah. So we'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that when we first talked, I think the discussion about like really the relationship between him and Mitch McConnell, because I think Mitch McConnell has been one of the detriments to our society in the last few years, and he's definitely the reason why I would say we need term limits. We never need to have another one of these guys. I don't think he's serving the public very well. What do you think?
I don't think Steve's serving the public well. I don't think Mitch McConnell's serving the public well at all. It's kind of become the two-headed Hydra thing. But
yeah, well, I mean, this could be a conversation that goes all day. Did you want to come back to a solar conversation today, or did you want to have that one again some other time?
Let's do a separate energy conversation. Okay. I'm just guessing it becomes easier for editing and, if Absolutely. I'm looking at stuff and I want to see a topic and you've got it labeled with something, that makes sense.
Yeah. And let's not bury it, I guess. But this is, it's been a pretty fun one. So,
I do have one more thing that I wanted to mention. So this is back to the current Republican Party and how I remember it and how I would like to have it get back to being. So, you know, in the Eisenhower Lincoln mode. In the second Bush election, so that would have been 2004.
Yep.
My son, who was at that time 10 years old, I remember being at my parents' house visiting, and so my father was fairly old at that point, and we were having a political conversation, and then shortly we had to get in the car and drive back to where I lived for, you know, a 2-hour drive kind of thing. And my son said this as a 10-year-old. He said, "Doesn't Grandpa understand that the people he's voting for don't care about him anymore?" And I was like, wow, that's really thoughtful for someone who's 10 years old to be able to see that.
Well, I think that I haven't said this, but I think it's probably important. But I have a 5-year-old, and trying to explain to him some of the things that our current president says, I've never lived in a time like this. And it's hard, you know, because you want to promote the fact that, you know, this is a U.S. president, and, you know, you should be able to listen to the U.S. president. You should be able to explain what they say to your children and explain their actions that way. So it's very disheartening to me.
It would be nice to be able to elect people to go to Washington who represent their constituency.
Yeah. Well, I think that if we make this a high enough percentage of candidates this time, I think we could pull people into the center and start getting some stuff done.
Good.
Yeah. So I'm optimistic, but, you know, dreamer.
All right.
What does it mean to be a Democrat or Republican anymore? Who knows? I do know what it means to be establishment or anti-establishment, and definitely I'm anti-establishment. So keep paying attention, keep listening. We'll see if we can do this together. I'm Daniel Larson. Thanks for listening.